So we had the description of the middle portion of the island, um, surrounding the pillar of heaven, Menel Tarma. So now we in a little bit of the southern portion where the tomb of the kings was. A little bit of um, seasonal culture in terms of what they do surrounding the mountain and a connection to Iluvatar. The first time we see any kind of actual worship of Eru outright in Middle Earth, or well, in the lands between Valar and Middle Earth, I should say. But for the most part, the Mitalmar was a region of pastures. In the southwest, there were rolling downs of grass, and there in the Emerie was the chief region of the shepherds. The Forostar was the least fertile part. That's the northern promontory, right? Stony with few trees, save that on the westward slopes of the high heather-covered moors there were woods of fir and larch. Towards the North Cape the land rose to rocky heights, and there great Sorrentil rose, sheer from the sea in tremendous cliffs. Here was the abode of many eagles. And in this region Tar Meneldur El Entirmo built a tall tower, from which he could observe the motions of the stars. So we have an observatory, and we see that astrology is important to the Numenorians. So this is interesting as well. We do see a little bit of astrology in Middle-earth in general, I think with the Elvish typically. And here we see that there's a level of importance in it, even in Numenor. The Andustar was also rocky in its northern parts. The Andustar is the western lands, with high fir woods looking out upon the sea. 3 small bays it had, facing west, cut back into the highlands. But here the cliffs were in many places not at the sea's edge, and there was a shelving land at their feet. I'm not very good with any of this. I'm assuming a shelving land would be like some kind of a flat land with the shore, and then it just rises to these tremendous cliffs. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. Also, is this at all reflective of Scotland in any way? Maybe somebody can shed light on that for me. The northmost of these was called the Bay of Andunier, for there was the great haven of Andunier, which in parentheses they say means sunset, with its town beside the shore and many other dwellings climbing up the steep slopes behind. It makes me also think of kind of like the Riviera in France or something. I mean, again, I don't know. I'm just guessing. I'm very not educated on this. But much of the southerly part of the Andustar was fertile. And there also were great woods of birch and beech, and upon the upper ground, and in the lower vales of oaks and elms. The specificity of trees is awesome. Between the promontories of the Andustar and the Hjarnustar, so now we're talking about the western and the southwestern promontories, between those two was the great bay that was called Eldana, because it faced towards Eresia and the lands about it. Being sheltered from the north and open to the western seas, were warm, and the most rain fell there. At the center of the Bay of Eldana was the most beautiful of all the havens of Numenor, Eldalond, the Green, and hither, in the earlier days, the swift white ships of the Eldar of Eresia came most often. So it seems that, at least in its beginning, Numenor had a strong connection with Valinor, albeit through just the visitations of the elves on ships. Still, that's a pretty big deal. All about that place, up the seaward slopes and far into the land, grew the evergreen and fragrant trees that they brought out of the west, and so throve there that the Eldar said that almost it was fair as a haven in Eresia. They were the greatest delight of Numenor, and they were remembered in many songs long after they had perished forever, for few ever flowered east of the land of gift. Oiolaire and Lairelosse, Nesamelda, Vardariana, Tanicolasse, and Yavanamire. I don't know if I'm saying any of that right. With its globed and scarlet fruits. That's quite a bunch of species of trees that he is naming. Flower, leaf, and rind of those trees exuded sweet scents, and all that country was full of blended fragrance. Therefore it was called Nisimaldar, the fragrant trees. You can almost smell it, right? I mean, this is what I love about, there's a sense of ambiance. There's a sense of you have visited this place. This place has these actual trees, these actual, it's defined, it's livable. It's not just something, you know, there for the sake of a storyline. And I think that was always the case with Tolkien. That was, I think, interesting, that the story was meant to give life to the land and its beings and its creations and its even its language, rather than the other way around, which is, you can tell the difference between Tolkien and any other writer of fantasy in that regard. Many of them were planted and grew, though far less abundantly in other regions of Numenor, but only here grew the mighty golden tree Malinorne, reaching after 5 centuries a height scarce less than it's achieved in Eresia itself. Its bark was silver and smooth, and its boughs somewhat upswept after the manner of the beech, but it never grew save with a single trunk. Its leaves, like those of the beech but greater, were pale green above, and beneath were silver, glistening in the sun. In the autumn they did not fall, but turned to pale gold. In the spring it bore golden blossom in clusters like a cherry, which bloomed on during the summer, and as soon as the flowers opened, the leaves fell, so that through spring and summer a grove of Malinorni was carpeted and roofed with gold, but its pillars were of gray silver. Wow, what a depiction, right? I mean, you can't even recreate that level of beauty unless you really wanted to pay attention to what he's writing here. I mean, it does take a level of admiring and caring for what he's bringing to the foreground with this depiction. And this is exactly what I have an issue with all of the adaptations of the elves, is that it never reaches this. I mean, he gives you detail. It should be easy for you. There's not much left to chance. And yet, could you imagine if we had been able to see these trees when Galadriel goes to, obviously, what's going to be Eldalond, I'm assuming, where Elendil is from? If she had seen these trees, if they had bothered to depict these trees for us, a conversation under these trees where the leaves are gold on the ground and the bark of the tree is silver, I mean, that would have been impressive, right? Its fruit was a nut with a silver shale, and some were given as gift by Tar Aldarion, the 6th king of Numenor, to King Gil-galad of Lindon, which we'll discuss Aldarion in the next story, which is what I really wanted to get to. They did not take root in that land, but Gil-galad gave some to his kinswoman Galadriel, and under her power they grew and flourished in the guarded land of Lothlorien, beside the river Anduin, until the High Elves at last left Middle-earth. But they did not reach the height or girth of the great groves of Numenor. So we have another perspective there. I believe he does describe this for us in Lothlorien, right? The river Nunduine flowed into the sea at Eldalond, and on its way made the little lake of Nisinen, and that was so named from the abundance of sweet-smelling shrubs and flowers that grew upon its banks. I mean, you want to live on this island now, right? I mean, it's just wonderful. Now we're going to move on to the southwestern promontory. The Hjarnustar was in its western part a mountainous region with great cliffs on the western and southern coasts, but eastwards were great vineyards in a warm and fertile land. So now, for me, it evokes a little bit of what, Tuscany in Italy? Correct me if I'm wrong. The promontories of the Hjarnustar and the Hjarostar were splayed wide apart, right? So the southwest and southeastern promontories. And on those long shores, sea and land came gently together, as nowhere else in Numenor. Here flowed down Cyril, the chief river of the land, for all others, save for the Nunduine in the west, were short and swift torrents hurrying to the sea, that rose in springs under the Meneltarma in the valley of Noirinan, and running through the Mit Almar southwards became in its lower course a slow and winding stream. It issued at last into the sea amid wide marshes and reedy flats, and its many small mouths found their changing paths through great sands. For many miles on either side were white beaches and grey shingles, and here the fisherfolk mostly dwelt, in villages upon the hards, among the marshes and meres, of which the chief was Nindamos. So we've moved from the northern down the western portion, now into the south and coming back around. The southeastern promontory in the Hjarostar grew an abundance of trees of many kinds, and among them the laurinque, in which the people delighted for its flowers, for it had no other use. This name they gave it because of its long hanging clusters of yellow flowers, and some who had heard from the Eldar of Laurelin, the golden tree of Valinor, believed that it came from that great tree, being brought in seed thither by the Eldar, but it was not so. From the days of Tar al-Darion there were great plantations in the Hjarostar to furnish timber for shipbuilding. Interesting. So it's the timber area, shipbuilding. It's got a unique tree of yellow flowers that resembles or evokes laurelin. Now we move to the eastern. The Orostar was a cooler land, but it was protected from the cold northeast winds by highlands that rose towards the end of the promontory, and in the inner regions of the Orostar much grain was grown, especially in those parts near to the borders of Arandor. So this is the grain belt? I don't know. The whole land of Numenor was so posed as if it had been thrust upward out of the sea, but tilted southward and a little eastward. Interesting. And save upon the south, the land in nearly all places fell towards the sea in steep cliffs. In Numenor, birds that dwell near the sea and swim or dive in it abode in multitudes beyond reckoning. Nice. The mariners said that were they blind, they still would know that their ship was drawing near to Numenor because of the great clamor of the birds of the shore. And when any ship approached the land, seabirds in great flocks would arise and fly above it in welcome and gladness, for they were never killed or molested by intent. Some would accompany ships on their voyages, even those that went to Middle-earth. Likewise, within the lands, the birds of Numenor were beyond count, from the Kirinki, that were no bigger than wrens, but all scarlet, with piping voices on the edge of human hearing, to the great eagles that were held sacred to Manwë and never afflicted until the days of evil and the hatred of the Valar began. For 2,000 years, from the days of Elros Tar-Miniatur until the time of Tar-Ankalimon, son of Tar-Atanamir, there was an eyrie in the summit of the tower of the king's palace in Armenelos, and there one pair ever dwelt and lived on the bounty of the king. So we've come full circle, it feels, and we're almost done with the description, but there's still a little bit more, and even down to the birds, we've got details and a sense of what it was like to live there. I don't remember ever seeing that detail of eagles or even birds of the sea in Numenor in Rings of Power. Maybe I missed it. Maybe it was there and I just didn't notice, distracted by the story, but nonetheless, it feels like this is something that should have been almost in your face. There's this many birds hanging about.